Jason here for Pirate Wizard Dragon and Body Mod 101. I'm doing an upload. This is episode number 4 of the history of body modification according to me and the research I'm doing. This week I'm going to focus primarily on Japanese tattoos, which I did a bunch of research on, and I've got some notes here to go over because it's hard for me to keep track of all this in my head. It's going to be a long video, so I'm just letting you know right now I'm going to try to keep it under 10 minutes. It's probably going to run on a little longer just because there's a lot of stuff I want to cover. So I've already wasted 30 seconds just doing that even. So please bear with me, and I hope you enjoy. First of all, there's a word for Japanese tattoos that is called irizumi. I might be pronouncing that wrong, so I'll spell it. It's I-R-E-Z-U-M-I, and it literally means to insert ink. Tattooing for spiritual purposes in Japan is thought to extend back to at least the Jomon or Paleolithic period, approximately 10,000 BCE before Common Era, 10,000 years before Common Era, or BC before Christ. Just a little side note in history, they changed the whole before Christ thing to before Common Era because it offended people. So I use both. I don't know, whichever one you prefer that doesn't offend you. Some scholars have suggested that the distinctive chord patterns observed on the faces and bodies of figures that they've dug up in Japan, they date back to this period. They represent tattoos, but this claim is by no means unanimous. There are similarities, however, between such markings and the tattoo traditions observed in other contemporaneous cultures. Basically, the patterns found on some of the figures are very similar to other cultures where tattooing was done in this fashion far back in time, back to possibly even 10,000 years ago, which I believe is correct, but scholars argue over this, and that some people say that this is true and some people say it is not. So, that being said, I'm not here to debate what scholars believe or don't believe. I'm just trying to give you a little history. And the Japanese tattoo history is fascinating. So that is really, really old. That's just really far back. Once again, there's not much, and I've covered this in previous videos. There's not a lot of definitive proof that tattooing was done 10,000 years ago. We haven't dug up the oldest mummy that we have found is the Iceman, and that dates about 5,000 years ago, the 5,000 before Common Era. So that's basically as far back as it goes there. Anyways, moving on. In the, and I can't pronounce this word, the Yayoi period, Y-A-Y-O-I, so Yayoi period, which is 300 BCE to 300 AD, or Common Era. So for about a 600-year period, tattoo designs were observed and remarked upon by Chinese visitors that visited Japan. Such designs were thought to have spiritual significance as well as function as a status symbol. So that's kind of interesting that at least, we have some written proof in journals that Chinese visitors that visited Japan brought back to China that they have found talking about certain designs. Just to go back to the first part, clay figures in tombs dated back to 3000 BC and 2nd and 3rd millennia before Common Era. Stand-in figures, kind of like what the Vikings did with their burials. They would have not the Vikings, the Egyptians, excuse me. They would have a figure that would kind of be representative of them in the afterlife that they would put in with their tombs. The Japanese had this way back in, the 3,000 years before Common Era. They had similar figures, and because the figures represented the people that were buried and the images and markings on the figures looked like tattoos, people have commented that this possibly shows that tattooing was done at least 3,000 years before Common Era in Japan. The very first written Japanese art of tattooing is found, like I said, in the Chinese dynastic history compiled around 297 Common Era, which I told you is, in the Yayoi period. So that's in the later end of the Yayoi period. The Horus, and I'm still researching this word, and it's not Horus like the Egyptian, and I'm not even probably pronouncing it correctly. It's Horis. They were considered Japanese masters, and they were the undisputed masters of tattooing in Japan. And in their time, their use of colors and perspective was the most, completely. These Japanese tattoo masters moved tattooing in a whole different direction from a primitive sort of symbols and marks and chords and lines to what we see now as common tattooing. They moved tattooing in a direction more complicated, I guess you could say. They made it more just the designs became a lot more. I can't even think of the word I'm trying to use. But anyways, to move on, better for lack of a better word, no pun intended. Starting in the Kofun period, which is Kofun, which is 300 AD to 600 AD, tattoo designs begin to assume negative connotations, and this is where the history of Japanese tattoos gets interesting. Instead of being used for ritual or spiritual purposes or status purposes, tattooed marks began to be placed on criminals as punishment. This was mirrored in ancient Rome, where slaves were known to have tattooed with such mottos such as "I'm a slave who has run away from his master," and other mottos that the Romans tattooed on slaves to mark them. This is a common thing you find in history. Tattoos were used for the marks to mark slaves or to mark ownership on other human beings, which is a perversion, in my opinion, of what tattoos, the heart of tattoos. Like I do not personally believe tattoos should ever be used to mark ownership on a human being, and that's even done nowadays. I personally canceled a friend recently on how I thought that was a bad idea, and I can't believe that it would still be done nowadays, that people would put on their body that they belong to somebody else. Because personally, this body is mine. It belongs to nobody else, not even Jesus. Sorry, this is mine. So that's how I feel about tattoos, and that's just getting away from the whole history of Japanese tattoos. But that's around that time, so 300 AD to 600 AD or Common Era is when tattoos in Japan became associated with negative connotations. And people, there's an indigenous culture that's kind of in Japan and near. I'm still trying to figure out. I'm doing research on this culture. It's called the AINU people. The Ainu people. They were the indigenous people of Japan, and they were known to have tattoos for decorative and social purposes. There's no known relationship to the development of irizumi, which is the traditional Japanese tattoos, and this indigenous people of Japan. So that's something I came across in my studies. In the Edo period, I think it's Edo period in Japan, 1600, this is getting more into the common era now of tattooing. In 1600 to 1868, the role of tattoos in Japanese society fluctuated. Tattooed marks were still used as punishment, but minor fads for decorative tattooing. Some featured designs that would be completed only when lovers' hands were joined. I thought that was very beautiful. Like, just to read that is kind of neat. So, some designs would only be completed as when like lovers' hands were put together. So like it'd be a picture that was complete when the hands connected. I thought that was kind of a beautiful sentiment as a historical note in Japanese history. So that's something that that kind of was like a fad, I guess. People still do similar things nowadays. I've seen similar tattoos done even in modern times that are like that, or rings. A lot of people that instead of getting a traditional marriage ring, they'll get a wedding ring tattooed on their fingers to symbolize their commitment to one another. Also came and went. It was in the Edo period, however, that Japanese decorative tattooing began to develop in the advanced art form known as today. The impetus, the catalyst for this development was woodworking, believe it or not. And this is something that I found pretty neat because this is something I didn't know. The art of woodblock printing and the release of the popular Chinese novel called Suikoden, Suikoden. I looked this up a little further. It was a 14th century novel. It's considered one of the 4 great classical novels of China, and it means in English water margin. So it's a tale of rebel courage and manly bravery, illustrated with lavish woodblock prints showing heroic scenes and the heroes were lavishly decorated with dragons, mythological beasts, flowers, ferocious tigers, and religious images. So this book that came out in the 14th century created almost simultaneously a demand in Japan for tattoos. People read this book, they saw the illustrations, and they wanted these tattoos, which is pretty interesting because even nowadays that kind of, you can see how visually we are influenced by what we see. Tattooing has become much more popular in our culture in modern times because of what is on television, what we see on basketball players or movie stars or Miami Ink, or you get where I'm going here. So that I thought was pretty cool. That's what kind of brought tattooing to a more popular acceptance, instead of it being known just for a negative connotation, which is what it still, even to this day in Japan, has a negative connotation. I'll get to that. I did some research on that too. So I thought that was kind of cool. And wood block artists began tattooing in the Edo period. So they took their skills from doing wood blocking and printing, and they used some of the same tools for imprinting designs in the human flesh to create their art. So they used chisels, gouges, and most importantly, a unique ink known as Nara ink, or Nara black. The ink famously turns blue-green under the skin, and there is an academic debate over who wore these elaborate tattoos. Some scholars say that it was lower classes who wore and flaunted such tattoos. Others claim wealthy merchants, barred by law from flaunting their wealth, wore expensive irizumi under their clothes. It is known for certain that irizumi became associated with firemen, which is kind of interesting because a lot of firemen get tattoos nowadays also in our culture. Dashing figures of bravery and roguish sex appeal who wore them as a form of spiritual protection. Once again, you see this theme throughout the history of body modification, that tattoos were not just pictures on the skin or art. They were for protection. They were certain images and designs that were specifically used to protect somebody from a certain element, whether it was fire or the evil eye or a disease. A lot of times tattoos were used to protect from certain diseases or to protect the baby, as I've talked about in Egypt. Really, some of the earliest tattoos were used for that. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, I know I'm going a little long here. It's going to be longer than 15 minutes probably. So tattoos in modern Japan at the beginning of the Meiji period, which is September 1868 to July 1912. Now, I don't know how I haven't researched how these periods are split up into Japan. The history of Japan and the history of China are quite extensive, with periods going from certain times and dynasties, and this is just scratching the surface of the history of Japanese tattoos. And I'm going to probably be spending till my dying day researching this kind of stuff because I love it. It fascinates me. So that's the first, this period, the Meiji, M-E-I-J-I period, is the first half of the Emperor of Japan. And in this period, they moved from isolated feudalism more towards its modern form of how we know Japan today. So the Japanese government, wanting to protect its image and make a good impression on the West and to avoid ridicule, shoguns outlawed tattoos, and irizumi took on connotations of criminality. Nevertheless, fascinated foreigners went to Japan seeking the skills of tattoo artists, and traditional tattooing continued underground. Tattooing was legalized in Japan by the occupation forces in 1948. So it was outlawed by the shogun, and then when the occupation forces took control of Japan in 1948, they legalized it, probably because the military wanted to get tattoos. But it has retained its image of criminality. For many years, traditional Japanese tattoos were associated with the Yakuza, Japanese notorious mafia. And that in itself is another thing I will be focusing an entire episode on, the history of the Yakuza, because I find it fascinating too. And many businesses in Japan, such as public baths, fitness centers, and hot springs, still ban customers with tattoos to this day. Although tattoos have gained popularity among the youth due to Western influence, there's still a stigma placed on them amongst general consensus. Unlike the United States, even finding a tattoo shop in Japan may prove difficult, with tattoo studios primarily being placed in areas that are very touristy or U.S. military friendly. According to Kunihiro Shimada, Kunihiro Shimada, the president of the Japanese Tattoo Institute, today, quote, "Today, thanks to years of government suppression, there are perhaps 300 artists in Japan. In general, tattoos are frowned upon with..." Okay, sorry, the quote ended at Japan. So, today, thanks to years of government suppression, there are perhaps 300 tattoo artists in Japan, unquote. So there's not as many tattoo artists in Japan as one would think, but it is a small island, so compared to the United States, there's probably 10 times that. Easily. In general, tattoos are frowned upon, with many Japanese establishments banning, like I said, to serve those. They even post signs outside of the bathhouses, the hot springs, and they tell people either to cover up your tattoos or don't even bother coming in. There's even current political persecution in Japan for people with tattoos, which I found interesting, even up until last year. There are current political repercussions for tattoos in Japan. In 2012, the mayor of Osaka, his name is Toru Hashimoto, started a campaign to rid companies of their employees with tattoos. According to an article written about Hashimoto, and this was in The Economist magazine, 2012, paragraph 3, I guess, in this one article, he is on a mission to force workers in his government to admit to any tattoos they have, and if they're in obvious places, and if they have them, they should remove them or find work elsewhere. And the thing about this is that his beliefs are fairly well received by the public, as well as many large companies whom already are tattoo phobic. Citing with him, modern tattoos in Japan are done similarly to how Western tattoos are done in their application. Machines now are used instead of the old wooden chisel method, and where they group up needles made of wood or metal and they prick the skin, because it's a lot faster, less painful. And this is, I'm sure there's some really good Irizumi artists that there still is actually artists that use the traditional methods of tattooing in Japan. The done by hand, no machines, no electricity. But in general, it takes a lot longer. And most artists nowadays are using machines in Japan. So it's difficult to find an artist that does the traditional Irizumi style of applying the Japanese tattoos. Most of them are not in the big cities like Tokyo. They're on outskirts or hard to find. So that's just a scratch on the surface. I said the kind of just giving you an idea of the background of Japanese tattoos. One of the other things that Japan is known for is their bodysuits. Those can take anywhere from 1 to 8 years to finish, and they can cost anywhere from the lower end of $30,000 to who knows how much, probably 3 times that, I'm sure, with the client going once a week, even being tattooed for many hours at a time. And a big difference between the way tattoos, this is, not, once again, not the be-all, end-all, but a lot of Japanese tattoo artists that study their tradition and do their tattoos, like do bodysuits. It's not like here in America where I go in with the design, I hand it to the artist, and they say, okay, I can do this, and they put it on my body. In Japan, the tattoo artists have a lot more control over how the design is going to look, and they can be like, no, I don't want to tattoo you. I don't like this design. No, this is how it's going to look. So they have a lot more control over the tattoo design and the bigger picture of how it's going to end up, especially if they're doing a whole bodysuit, which I found interesting. So if you're getting a bodysuit done, you have to have a lot of faith and just be willing to kind of give up your expectations of what it's going to look like and trust in the artist to complete the bodysuit, which is a lot different than the way we do it here in Western society and the way we do tattooing. Although I do a lot of times just give my tattoo artists a lot of freedom because they love it. And, I have ideas, and I definitely do. There's a back and forth consultation going on. But anyways, I don't want to make this any longer. We're going on 20 minutes. Thank you all for watching episode 4 of History of Body Modification, according to me, Jason. I'm going to post this on my personal channel and BodMod 101. So I hope you all like it, and please leave me some comments, give me some feedback. I'm probably going to, I think most likely I'm going to concentrate on Polynesian tattoo history next time. I had a request for that. I was going to do that this time, but I just got real sucked into the whole history of Japanese tattoos. And I'm probably going to revisit a lot of these topics again as I do research, and I'm just a little scattered right now. I got a lot going on in my life personally. But thank you for your time, and if you did stick to this into the video, I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something, and maybe you can do some research yourself and school me if I'm wrong, please. I'm not, a lot of this I just get off the internet, or I look in the library, or like this came from 2 different sources on the internet. So please, questions, try to answer anything anybody wants to know. And thank you once again. I love you and have a great day. Much love. Bye.